Welcome to Golden Blue Dude, everybody, home of the college football fan. And don't forget, you can send gear to represent your team for the background of Golden Blue Dude forever. Just send gear to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina 29657. Let's get to the next video. This will be a Get It Gang video. If you don't know what the Get It Gang is, it is a name that I came up with for the group of people that come up with video ideas and post it in the comments section of my videos. So if you think you have a good video idea, post it in the comments section and I just might use it. Today's Get It Gang video idea actually wasn't an idea, it was a response, but I saw this response and it got me to thinking. This was a comment from Ryan C, and he was actually responding to another comment named Tar Heel. He says, I don't agree with you on much, but we can agree here. Why would ESPN allow the ACC to dissolve into irrelevance compared to the SEC Big Ten? Why would ESPN shoot itself in the foot by forcing the ACC to keep a terrible contract until 2036 gets here, and the biggest brands jump to a conference with Fox, talk about the Big Ten, rather than possibly re-upping with ESPN because ESPN treated them right? You have some points in there. You really do, and I've said that. It wouldn't make any sense why ESPN actually wants the ACC to dissolve, and by making the ACC stay in this terrible TV contract, you're basically guaranteeing that. That's why I'm putting some stock, not everything, not a lot, but some stock into the rumors that Florida State is leading the way between talks as far as Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford possibly joining the ACC. So I want to focus on Florida State and how much they could influence the future of the ACC, the SEC, the Big Ten, and to a certain extent, the Big 12. And don't forget about the Pac-12. They could be the start of completely dissolving the Pac-12 as well. So Florida State could influence all 5 Power 5 contracts. The first thing I'm talking about, I just mentioned it. Florida State leading talks between the ACC and Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford as far as adding them to the ACC. Academics, this makes perfect sense. Geographically, no, it doesn't make much sense at all. You'd have East Coast teams and you'd have West Coast teams and nothing in the middle. And we're not talking about like 12 teams on the East and 12 teams on the West. We're talking about 14 teams on the East and just 4 teams on the West. That's a little lopsided if you ask me. And I'm sure the schedule could be worked out to a certain extent. Oregon could travel with Washington. Cal could travel with Stanford. But still, that would be a crazy, crazy schedule for Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford. But because of that comment, and yes, it wouldn't make sense why ESPN wants the ACC to dissolve, because they'd be losing big brands to one of their biggest competitors in Fox, as far as losing 4 members to the Big Ten. So yes, I put a little bit of stock into that rumor. And it would change the ACC. It would solidify the ACC, and the ACC probably would be one of the conferences standing with the Big Ten and the SEC as far as when they do eventually break off from the NCAA and create their own playoffs and national championship, which, by the way, I firmly believe that will happen. So the next thing I want to talk about, Florida State backs out of voting to dissolve the grant of rights. It is believed that Florida State is one of those 8 teams that will vote to dissolve the grant of rights, and that way the teams in the ACC can go wherever they want. But what if Florida State backs out of that? I don't think the ACC would have the numbers to vote to dissolve the grant of rights if Florida State were to back out. Not only because they would be losing a vote to dissolve, but I think Florida State would influence other voters as well. And that plays into what I mentioned earlier. Florida State talking to Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford. That could be a sign that they are thinking about backing out of voting to dissolve. And maybe, just maybe, that's one of the reasons why it actually hasn't happened yet. Florida State strongly thinking about backing out as far as voting to dissolve the grant of rights. And that would be the key as far as securing the future of the ACC. The next thing is Florida State actually leads the vote to dissolve the grant of rights. In other words, they go forward with it. The talks between the ACC and Oregon, Washington, Cal, and Stanford fall through. That's not happening. Florida State's like, well, we're not happy with this TV deal. ESPN is not renegotiating. All right, let's do it. Let's vote to dissolve the grant of rights. So they actually lead the way. This affects the Big Ten and the SEC as far as what conference would get what teams. Because right now, Florida State is very, very, very close to getting AAU status. And whenever that happens, if that does happen, then they become a prime candidate for the Big Ten. So if Florida State gets AAU status and they choose the Big Ten and the ACC does dissolve, here's how I think that shakes out. I think the Big Ten would get Florida State, North Carolina, Duke, and Georgia Tech. I think the SEC would get Clemson, NC State, Virginia, and the Miami Hurricanes. And the team that would be left out as far as not getting into the Big Ten or the SEC would be Virginia Tech. But if Florida State chooses the SEC after the ACC dissolves, then I think the Big Ten gets Virginia, North Carolina, Duke, and Georgia Tech. And I think the SEC gets Florida State, Clemson, Virginia Tech, and NC State. So in that scenario, the Miami Hurricanes would be left out as far as the Big Ten or the SEC. So Virginia Tech doesn't want Florida State to get AAU status and doesn't want Florida State to be interested in the Big Ten because they would be left out as far as going to the SEC because the SEC would choose the Miami Hurricanes over Virginia Tech. And if you're the Miami Hurricanes, you actually do hope that Florida State gets AAU status and chooses the Big Ten. Otherwise, they're left out in favor of Virginia Tech for the SEC because the SEC just wants one Florida market. So if Florida State chooses the SEC, the Miami Hurricanes are out. But if Florida State chooses the Big Ten, the Miami Hurricanes are in the SEC. So that's just something to think about in the future if you're Miami Hurricanes fans. You actually want Florida State to get AAU status and to choose the Big Ten. Your chances of getting into the SEC go up significantly. If you're a Virginia Tech fan, you actually hope Florida State doesn't get AAU status and that they choose the SEC. And Florida State would be that one extra Florida brand that the SEC takes, so the Miami Hurricanes would be out and Virginia Tech would be in. I've also heard that Virginia Tech is pursuing AAU status as well. And AAU status isn't the end-all, be-all for the Big Ten, but it plays a big-time factor because think about this. Pitt has AAU status. Pitt won the ACC a couple years ago in 2021, and they were pretty good this year. Their football brand, and I hate saying this because I'm a West Virginia fan, but their football brand is pretty good. And it looks like Pitt might make the big dance in college basketball as well. And West Virginia did beat Pitt this year, but West Virginia's in the Big 12, and the Big 12 is a tough conference to win in basketball. In fact, yesterday, West Virginia lost to Texas on the road 94-60. We got absolutely shellacked. But we do have some good wins. Point is, it's tougher to win in the Big 12. So even though West Virginia has proven they are a better basketball team than Pitt, Pitt actually has a better chance to get in the big dance because they're in the ACC. Bottom line is Pitt has a good football brand right now, and they have a decent basketball brand, and they have AAU status. But because the Big Ten already has Penn State, and Penn State would not like it if Pitt was in the Big Ten, and Pitt does not bring a big revenue bump for the Big Ten, Pitt would not be accepted into the Big Ten. That's why I said AAU status is not the end-all, be-all. But for a brand like Florida State, that is the last check mark that the Big Ten would be waiting on as far as inviting and accepting Florida State into the Big Ten. So it is a big deal as far as the future of the Big Ten, the SEC, the ACC, maybe even the Pac-12 and the Big 12. If Florida State gets AAU status and decides, yes, we want to go to the Big Ten. And that would be a big deal for the Big Ten because they do want a footprint in the state of Florida, and their only chance is Florida State. They're not grabbing the Miami Hurricanes. Florida's not leaving the SEC anytime soon, so it comes down to Florida State. And that's the point that I want to make with this video. Florida State could, doesn't mean any or all of this will happen, but could affect the future of all Power 5 conferences, especially if they get AAU status. Something to keep your eyes out for Florida State. So y'all let me know in the comment section. Number one, do you think Florida State actually is leading talks between those four schools, Oregon, Washington, Stanford, and Cal, and the ACC as far as those four teams joining? Number two, if that's true, but the talks fall through, do you think Florida State still backs out of voting to dissolve the grant of rights and the ACC is still good at least for a while? Or do you think that Florida State actually leads the way and votes to dissolve the ACC? Next thing is, if they do lead the way, do you think Florida State gets AAU status and goes to the Big Ten? Or do you think they don't get AAU status and they go to the SEC? A lot of questions right there. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.